Can ancient secrets of the supernatural be rediscovered? Do angels exist?
Chuck Missler, you are such, in my opinion, and I'm entitled to say this, you are such a renowned, wonderful Bible teacher. Are you a little Miss Sugar? What are you talking about? UFOs, flying saucers? I don't get it.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the intended encouragement, but I really came at this whole subject because of my love for the Bible. It happens that I come out of an information science background. My whole career, 30 years in the strategic community, gives me perhaps a little different perspective than most people would have going at this topic. But I want to right up front indicate it was my biblical interest that brought me into this rather than my high-tech background, although that's proven to be, that and my Department of Defense connections have been very valuable to me. So that's one of the reasons I find myself in this peculiar posture.
So you found a controversial verse in Genesis 6, which has to do with a prophecy that Jesus said.
I start with Jesus, and in Matthew 24, he gives 4 disciples an inside briefing on a second coming. And in that briefing, he makes a very strange remark. He says, as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, many people presume he just meant that it was because of the business as usual. So anyway, the point is, we need to understand what the days of Noah were like in order to understand what he was saying. So that takes us to Genesis 6, and when you jump into Genesis 6, you quickly discover that very few seminaries teach what that passage really says. And so as you get into that Genesis 6, you have to understand the first 2 verses are one sentence, and it deals with the strange goings-on between the fallen angels producing hybrids with humans. And that was so uncomfortable in the early years of the church that it was the understanding of the early rabbis. It was also the understanding of the early church that what it was dealing with was fallen angels cohabiting with human women, producing a strange hybrid offspring. But when you get to about the 5th century, that was a very uncomfortable posture. So they cooked up this, what they call the lines of Seth argument, and that's what's taught in most seminaries. One of the things I discover is that many people who are products of most seminaries haven't been taught that there are different perspectives of Genesis 6, and it's the literal, careful study version of Genesis 6 that starts to raise the fog on this whole issue.
Now tell me about the word Nephilim. What does that mean?
In the Hebrew, it comes from the verb nephal. It means the fallen ones, and that's the term used. Don't confuse that with the fallen angels. The fallen angels, according to Genesis 6, cohabited with human women to produce a hybrid offspring that are called in the Hebrew the Nephilim. In the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, they use the word gigantes, which is transliterated giants, right. And they did happen to be giants, but that's not what the word means. The word actually means, in the Greek, the earthborn. And so, from the Greek point of view, they're earthborn. From the Hebrew point of view, they're the fallen ones. But either way, they're pointing to a hybrid, and it apparently was part of Satan's plan to contaminate the Messianic line.
But so the purpose of the flood was to get rid of these.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. When you study verse 9 of Genesis 6, it speaks of Noah that his genealogy was untainted, unblemished. And apparently it was a distinctive in that sense. He may not have been the only one unblemished, but the fact that he was unblemished qualified him for what God was going to do, among other things. But the point is, the whole issue that God chose to do was to save 8 people in the ark and erase the blackboard, so to speak.
Okay, but if the blackboard was erased, then we don't have to fool with them today, if they were all destroyed.
Except Genesis 6 verse 4 says there were Nephilim in the land in those days, comma, and also after that. And we discover, many good Bible scholars miss this, that you really won't understand subsequent events in the Old Testament by not realizing it happened again. When God in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17 confirms the land covenant to Abraham, he tells Abraham that he and his descendants are going to be away for 400 years, but after 400 years they're going to return. That gave Satan, who's obviously listening, the realization that he had 4 centuries to lay down a minefield. And that's why when Moses enters the land and he sends his at Kadesh Barnea, he sends in the 12 reconnoiters, if I can call them that. They come back and say, and Numbers 13, verse 33 says they were Nephilim in the land. So it happened again.
Well, we see in the text that there was violence, terrible violence. So it's my opinion that genetic manipulation took place of lizards there, and that all of this took place in the last 120 years leading up to the flood, which is what I believe Genesis 6:3 is really referring to. Genesis 6:3, I think, is overlooked a lot of times, where it says that my spirit will no longer dwell with man, for he's flesh, and his days should be 120 years. Well, he's flesh since Adam. So what's he talking about there? I believe that he created our bodies as a temple for who? The Holy Spirit, right? He created us in his image and likeness. We are in the image and likeness of God. We are, if I can use this term, a host body, right, for his spirit to indwell, right? We are the temple of the Holy Ghost. Well, if you corrupt this temple, God says, I ain't going to hang out with you. If you start genetically manipulating your body such that you corrupt the temple that's in my likeness, I'm not going to hang out with you anymore. I believe Genesis 6:3 is the warning. He's sending up a flare saying, hey, all this genetic manipulation you guys are doing, you better knock it off, because if you keep it up, I'm not going to be able to dwell with you anymore. And I think that transhumanism that we see today is nothing new under the sun. What has been done will be done again. I think that that's what we're seeing take place. And I believe it was taking place in the latter 120 years leading up to the flood. As I was contemplating these things, I happen to have these 2 books sitting on my desk, arranged in this order. Doug Hamp's book, Corrupting the Image, on the left, and Tom and Nita Horn's book, Forbidden Gates, on the right. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, what if that's the formula? What if corrupting the image that God created and called good and very good leads to opening forbidden gates that brings about the creation of Nephilim? Everybody likes to use the definition of Nephal, or from Nephilim comes from Nephal, to meaning to fall. But as we see in Strong's 5307, it has a number of other meanings besides just to fall. I think all of them are appropriate. I think when we think of the term to fall, that's a reference to something being corrupted and falling from its original state that God called good. When you corrupt that, you've fallen from that state. As I was thinking about that, I happened to go out and see the movie Spider-Man, one of the more recent ones that came out, where the main bad guy was the lizard, who was a scientist who had lost his arm, and he was doing experiments. Why is it that you could cut the tail off of a lizard and it grows back? What is the genetic code that allows limb regeneration? So he's experimenting. He cuts off the legs of mice and stuff, starts injecting them with lizard DNA, and eventually he gets a viable subject. The leg grows back. Aha! I've got it figured out. Awesome! So he injects his stump with this concoction, and what do you know? His arm grows back. Yay! That's awesome! But he had an unfortunate side effect. He became a giant lizard creature who had only evil continually in his heart and mind. He started out as a good guy.
You're not gonna get in the way of my plan, Peter Parker!
Do you see what I'm saying here? I think that's the reason why we had the text that Pastor Dan read earlier in Genesis, I believe it's 6:5, if I remember right, where it talks about that men had only evil continually in their hearts and minds. And I started thinking about that. I mean, there have been a lot of people in history that have been evil people who have done evil things. I mean, the Nazis did some pretty horrific things, right? But I'm sure they still had tender moments with their children and with their spouse, even though they did terrible things. So I started to think, what is it going to make only evil continually? If I'm a biblical literalist and take that literally, I believe it was this act of genetic manipulation where they started doing things and they had no idea what the byproduct of it would be. And maybe it was progressive, because I would imagine it was probably seductive to do this transhumanist thing. I mean, wouldn't you like to see like an eagle, run like a cheetah, have the radar of a bat or the sonar of a dolphin? Wolverine! I mean, come on.
Not if this is the price.
Well, but if you didn't know that was the price,
Right, exactly.
the sales pitch is wonderful, but what happens after 25,000 miles? I mean, and I believe that carried over into the post-flood return of the Nephilim. And I believe Moses, the same guy who wrote Genesis 6:4, tells us exactly how that happened. Again, I like timelines. This is a larger timeline that I created, showing the 350 post-flood years of Noah's life, looking at the text, where did the Nephilim come from? Looking at Genesis 9:18, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, this is a smoking gun that obliterates the multiple incursion idea. It says in Genesis 9:18 and 19, and the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And oh, by the way, Ham is the father of Canaan. Why did he put that there? He just decided to insert something there. Okay. Oh, and Ham fathered a lot of people. So why did he just single out all this? Why did he put that there? This is before the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. So he just says, oh, by the way, Ham fathered Canaan.
Because what Ham did to his dad.
Well, I'm not going to go there, but I don't think that that's the case. And I don't think he did anything with his dad. The nakedness of the father, if you read, I believe it's Leviticus 16 or somewhere thereabouts, it's a phrase, it's a reference to the wife, actually, of the husband. In other words, his mother. So it appears that he may have done, possibly, there's a lot of speculation on it.
Well, apart from whatever the acts were, and I know myriads of those things are what are suggested. But Canaan is the one who was mentioned in Noah's prophecy of the cursing and judgment. It's not even Ham.
That's right.
It's Canaan is
Right.
the one who's
Right.
mentioned.
Absolutely
So
right.
whatever, the focus becomes that, as well as when Abraham eventually is led to the land of Canaan.
Correct.
So,
Yeah, and that's important to point out, that the curse was not on Ham. The curse was on Canaan. And pretty much everybody who studies the subject of the Nephilim would admit that the Canaanites were Nephilim. That's why we see constant references throughout the Torah and the book of Joshua where God is telling the Israelites to utterly destroy these people, including the women and the children, in some cases even the animals and stuff. Wipe out everything. So we have a choice. Either God is prejudiced and schizophrenic and into random acts of genocide, or he has a legitimate reason for isolating those specific people groups, the Amorites, Jebusites, Girgashites, etc., for utter destruction, including women and children. Because in the standard rules of war, of course, the men go to battle, they fight each other, they kill each other, I get it. But they can also take the women and children and animals as spoils of war. They can take them. Except for the specific campaigns when you went to these certain ites that are listed in Genesis 10, 6 through 20, i.e. the Canaanites. And Moses tells you, oh, and by the way, Ham, not an angel, is the father of the Canaanites. And in case you don't get it, it says in verse 19, these are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth populated. Overspread in King James, right? Or overspread. This is about 800 to 850 years after the flood. Moses is saying the entire world was populated by these three people. So if he meant to say, except for that group of giants over there that were fathered by angels, this was the time to do it. But he didn't do that there. And then he goes to chapter 10 and tells you exactly where the ites come from.